Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. Welcome to another weekly study. And have you ever done stiff-legged deadlifts? It's probably the go-to, as far as I'm concerned. It's always been the go-to exercise. Even if I've got access to a leg curl machine to do the knee flexion component of hamstring training, which is also a great exercise, I have never not done stiff legged deadlifts. And I've done them in any number of ways. And when I'm training clients, of course, training athletes, there's some specificity to how you may do it. But when you're training the average client, I just want to give you some tips on this. So in today's video, what I'm going to go over is the issue. And by the way, this came about. I was talking with a trainer, and I asked him. I said, "So, what have you been seeing with some of your clients? What have been some of the complaints when it comes? Because I know what this exercise, if done incorrectly, could do." And he said, a lot of what's been happening is folks, again, average folks, have some issues with their what lower back. And so this is always, I don't think there's ever been a time where, at least with any number of clients, I've had complaints of lower back issues while they're doing any exercise, but in particular, the stiff legged deadlift. Once again, if you have access to a leg curl machine, for instance, or a seated leg curl, which is probably going to be the best exercise to have almost zero back stress. But even if you're doing a lying leg curl machine, even with the newer machine models where they actually create the hip hinging scenario for you, a little bit of it, there's still going to be some stress on the lower back, the erector spinae, and that's generally where we're going to see these issues. And that's going to be why people generally, quote, complain about discomfort. Now, this is provided there's no pathologies and there's no other issues with their lower back. It's just simply the stress of the movement pattern on the erector spinae. Because remember, during the hamstring exercise, the erector spinae are isometrically, or ideally, right? Technically, they should be isometrically contracted. In other words, you need to maintain a lordotic curve in the lower back because the stiff-legged deadlift is essentially a hip hinging movement. And there's supposed to be, again, ideally, supposed to be no other movement whatsoever while you're performing the exercise. It's purely hinging at the hip. But in order for the lumbopelvic area to remain stabilized, it's going to be isometrically loaded. It's just the nature of the beast. It's one of the reasons why it's actually a good exercise, because it can be very helpful for people with weak lower backs. The problem, of course, is that if you round your back, in other words, you create spinal flexion while you're doing the exercise, that's generally where the problem comes in. So talking with this one trainer, he made mention of that. And I said, this is probably a good topic of conversation to talk about during one of our weekly studies. So, and I hear it from trainers on a fairly regular basis. I've known it for the time that I've been training, that if we don't do the exercise properly, there's going to be some discomfort in the lower back. Again, even before I get into it, just keep in mind is the pain, and I'm talking about pain that is generally due to the loading of the erector spinae, simply because you're holding a weight and you're leaning forward. Whether you do the hip hinging perfectly or you're flexing the spinal column, you're going to feel it in your lower back, your erector spinae, no matter what. But from a safety perspective, you need to maintain that lordotic curve in the lower back while you're performing the exercise. So let's go ahead and get started. Just keep in mind that as we're going through this, the focus here is on trying to alleviate the pain. Okay, so remember, whenever you're training somebody, this is the real world application of this, is when you're training people and there's discomfort or there's what a client would call pain, you got to discern, is it real pain? Is it a sharp? Is it a shooting pain? Is it sciatic pain running down your leg? Sharp pain is generally indicative of some sort of nerve engagement. It could be acute injury, of course. But if it's just like a sharp pain, that's not good. Now, if there's a dull ache, and that's normally what I would ask my client, do you feel it, number one, on both sides of your lower back? And if the answer is yes, then I go, is it kind of a dull ache? And you go, yeah, I just feel like I'm working. I just feel that little tight. I go, okay, perhaps what we're dealing with is just a normal tension development and stress because that area of the body is being loaded more than it's been accustomed to, and you're going to feel it in your lower back, but the pain will ultimately go away as long as there's no pathology associated with it. Of course, if you're feeling it on one side than the other, then you've got a biomechanical issue, and that needs to be addressed. So back pain during stiff leg deadlifts, and I use the word pain. I probably should have put it in parentheses. But when I say back pain, I'm talking about discomfort and the muscle contraction and the fatigue associated with an exercise like this. So stiff leg deadlifts and back pain. Now, if you take a look at and I'm going to go ahead and put up my pen just so I can draw and we can keep track of this. Remember, stiff-legged deadlifts. Now, this guy's using a dumbbell, and I'm going to generally suggest that you use dumbbells anyway. As we get to the next slide, you're going to see why that is the case. But when you're training people, and for those of you that actually have the clients one-on-one, it's a little bit easier, of course, with a one-on-one scenario than for those of you that are doing small group. But your cueing is essentially the same. It's just I can spend a little bit more time and energy on a one-on-one client, but you need to be able to do this with your small group, 2, 3, 4, or 5 people as well. And this is one of the reasons why I want to go over this with you. So what's a good thing about stiff-legged deadlifts? Well, it's your go-to exercise for hamstrings, especially in those scenarios in a personal training studio. So those of you that have personal training studios that are condensed versions of health clubs, gyms, whatever, you're probably not using large pieces of equipment, such as a leg extension and leg curl machines. Those are very specific, targeted for obviously just 1 or 2 muscle groups. Therefore, in any sort of boutique training scenario, you're simply not going to have those pieces of equipment. They take up too much space, and they're just inefficient and unnecessary in that type of scenario. So your go-to exercise for the hamstrings is going to be the stiff-legged deadlift. Why? Because look at the equipment you're using, either a bar or in most cases, like I recommend, using dumbbells. Okay, so it's your go-to exercise for hamstrings. You've got to do this exercise, even though there is this trade-off where the lower back is going to get a significant amount of stress. But as I said before, it is ultimately of benefit so long as there's no actual pathological issues with the individual's lower back. Now, and that is because significant weight usage is possible. You know this. You're not using 10-pound dumbbells for stiff-legged deadlifts. Put those things down and grab yourself some real weight. Okay. Even the quote weakest client is not going to use that I've ever worked with on dumbbells. They're not using anything less than 20s or 25s. In fact, as with the case of holding a barbell, you are probably going to be more concerned with the ability to hold the weight versus the amount of load necessary to stress appropriately the hamstrings and the gluteal group. So just keep that in mind. This is one of the issues that we have. And by the way, it's why I don't do good mornings. Now, good morning is simply a stiff-legged deadlift, but you're holding the weight generally with a bar on your neck. The problem is that the torque that is generated on the lower back is significantly higher. And I just say never do those. They're just totally unnecessary to do good mornings. Again, the level of stress, the torque that is generated on the extension or spinal extension functionality of, especially at the lumbar spine, is significantly high, totally unnecessary. Always stick with your stiff-legged deadlift. So again, significant weight usage is possible, which means that there's going to be that level of engagement in the lumbar spine, even in the isometric contracted position. Just keep in mind, in isometric contraction, the erector spinae, which it is designed to do, that's one of its main functions, is isometric stabilization of the LPHC in the posterior aspect of the torso. So there you go. Significant weight usage is possible. Here's the thing, though. Hip hinging is critical for both safety and effectiveness. And one of the things that we often see that exacerbates or can be the initiating contributing factor to back pain when you're doing stiff-legged deadlifts is going to be Spinal flexion and extension. Now, remember, the lower back should be in a lordotic curve, which means that the erector spinae, when they are flexed and they're contracted, is going to pull the lower back, the lumbar spine, into the lordotic position that you see right here, into extension. And so that's the idea. If you allow for flexion to occur simultaneously with hip flexion, because remember, you're going to have hip flexion simultaneously with spinal flexion. Those two together are a disaster on your hip and the musculature and connective soft tissue in that area. So you got to maintain the lordotic curve while you are hinging at the hip, which is essentially hip flexion and extension. So hip flexion, right, is when the torso is going to go down forward, and then going back up into this position is hip extension. There's tremendous amount of effective, great stress on the gluteal group and the hamstrings. I mean, that's kind of what this exercise is designed to do. Most folks lose the fact that this is a great gluteal exercise, especially the way I'm going to show you. So lastly, the erector spinae here obviously are significantly stressed as well. This is generally where people are going to feel this discomfort or excessive stress on the lower back. Remember, if it's on both sides, they're feeling it all throughout from the lower, from that lower lumbaric vertebrae, even the sacrum area, all the way up to the middle back. Congratulations, you're working your erector spinae. It is uncomfortable. I get it. There are going to be a couple of ways we can kind of modify positioning to get your client to kind of relieve a little bit. Just keep in mind, you're never going to relieve completely the stress and the feeling that goes along with doing a stiff-legged deadlift correctly. Okay. So here's a couple of things you can do. Now, you can modify foot position. For instance, you can go from what we normally would view as a standard or conventional stiff-legged deadlift, which is essentially the feet are, roughly shoulder width apart, roughly in that area. Or you can actually go into a sort of midway sumo type of stance. Now, I actually do this as a modification, and it is a great way to engage the adductors, okay? So the adductors are going to come into it to help stabilize the pelvis, and the feet move further apart. So when you do a stiff-legged deadlift with your feet wide apart, you're actually going to feel it a whole lot more in the inner thigh or the adductors. And again, a tremendous amount of stress, especially when the feet are wider apart, is going to engage the gluteal group. Gluteus maximus is going to engage very strong when the feet are wider apart. Why? Because of the biomechanics and instability of the pelvis. And remember, the gluteus maximus's main function, for the most part, is not just extension at the hip, right? It's not just moving the leg back. It's a stabilizer. It's a main stabilizer of the pelvis. That's why it's such a large muscle. Anytime you lean forward, the gluteus maximus is engaged heavily. Now you're adding this increased load. So feet wide apart, great exercise, but that could assist. I'm going to be honest with you. Modification of foot position, wider or closer, probably not going to be the main way that you're going to sort of help a client with that discomfort. Why? Because whether your feet are wide apart or feet are close together, you're still hinging at the hip, which still means that you have to maintain the lordotic curve in the back, right? No matter what. So the lower back is always under that high level of stress. Now, you could do what I would generally recommend if it's really an issue for clients is to shift from the barbell right here, shifting from the barbell to dumbbells. Why? Because dumbbells allow you to do the one thing, obviously, you can't do with a barbell. That is modify the hand position. You can move the dumbbells back. You can move them forward. You can turn your hands, anything you can do with a dumbbell that's going to allow for a change in the relative torque associated with the lower back. Now, remember, the torque that's going to be on that lower back is going to be significant no matter what you do. But if it's really bad and I'm feeling it more in my lower back and then my hamstrings and my glutes, then guess what I can do with the dumbbell? As I lower the dumbbells don't have to go in front of my body. I can actually bring them behind me a little bit, and that will literally reduce the torque that's being generated when the hip is hinging, the torque that's generated on the lower back will be reduced. And therefore, it should take some stress off. So, although this guy modified foot position is one way to do it, I'm going to give barbell to dumbbell like a double check mark, because that can be the way, believe it or not, that literally takes the stress off. So get rid of the bar. It's bothering your client. Move to dumbbells and allow them to move the dumbbells back behind them a little bit, just to take that torqued stress off of the lower back. And you kind of play around with it, modify it, see where the position of the dumbbell needs to be. And that is a great sort of ratcheting it up to help your client. But here, to me, is the kicker. And before I even go into it, this guy gets the most checks. I'm giving him 3 checks, right? Because single leg offsets, started doing these years ago, and basically just blew me away at how effective they were. Now, the only thing that you have to keep in mind, and again, once you offset, in other words, you don't have to go that far forward. I just didn't have any good pictures on the internet of somebody that had just done a tiny little offset. Here's my recommendation: is you have your feet. I'm going to use this guy. You have your feet basically together like that, and you literally you can see, I'm going to move my hands on my feet. I'm just going to move just slightly to where my heel is in line. So my one heel is in line with my toes. Now, again, you could do it like this, but I'm going to recommend you start out with just a very slight offset. So you're literally standing feet shoulder width apart, a little bit closer than shoulder width apart. Just have your client just put that foot just a couple of inches forward. So the heel of the forward foot is basically in line with the toes of the rear foot. You can lift your rear heel off the ground like she's doing right here. There's nothing wrong with that. You could keep it flat. But the key here, this is why I'm going over this with you, is as soon as you offset, you basically are shifting the position of your pelvis. And anytime you shift the position of your pelvis, whether it be anterior, posterior tilting, whether there is a adducted or abducted movement position, right, tilting of the pelvis, right, side to side in the frontal plane, anytime you do that, I'm going to tell you, the gluteal group, all those muscles contralaterally heavily contract. And so this is what we're looking for. We're looking for a heavier contralateral contraction of the muscles, posterior muscles, hamstrings, glutes, in the leg that is forward. Okay, so the leg that's forward, as soon as you do the hip hinge and lean into that forward leg slightly, you are going to feel a tremendous stress and pull on that one side. So that, believe it or not, has been my way of literally getting somebody whose lower back is bothering them, almost takes the discomfort away. Why? Because once you do that offset, the erector spinae, they always are going to contract, but they don't have to go into that heavy contracted scenario that we see in all these other positions. And what I found is that anytime I do that with clients, no matter what type of weight they're using, lower back pain tends to diminish, and the stress on the hamstrings and the gluteal group on that one side significantly increases. And so the other side of the coin is that now basically it's not a double leg, right? So now you got to ensure that you realize you're doing a single leg. You got to do one side and then you got to do the other. So it may do a little bit to your timing if you're doing a time set, for instance. That's the least of your worries, in my opinion. So what do? You could modify foot position. Hey, if that works, then good, then go with that. More than likely, if you were to shift from the barbell to the dumbbell, that's great. By the way, if this doesn't work, that you're going to have to do something. Shift to dumbbells. Do the dumbbells work? If they do, fantastic. If they don't, you're going to have to think of something else. I've already thought of it for you. You might even do them already. Now you're going to go to the single leg offsets. Again, it's just remarkable how these just minor shifts in biomechanics can have a profound effect on how you feel. But always remember, let me go back up here. Go way back up here. You got to maintain the hip hinge. This is the key. You've got to maintain that. I don't care, foot position, sumo, conventional, maintain the hip hinge. It doesn't matter if you're using a barbell or a dumbbell. See how that works? Doesn't matter if you're using a barbell or you still got to maintain that hip hinge position. That is critical no matter how you do it. When you do the offset, your range of motion is going to be limited. Yes, it will, but you still must maintain the hip hinge. You can't allow the back to round forward. So again, one of the things we always try to keep in mind when we're going over an exercise like the stiff-legged deadlift is that the average person, the average client who doesn't exercise, doesn't train, they're going to feel it in their lower back no matter what. Discern where the pain is coming from and discern if the pain itself is just from the fact that you don't work out and your back is getting worked. Congratulations. Okay. Okay. It's good that your back is getting worked. It's when it's really, really uncomfortable. Like same thing if you're doing bent over rows or dumbbell rows. Just make sure you're getting your client to be in proper biomechanical position. Be careful about range of motion. But look, when it comes to stiff-legged deadlifts and back pain, I've seen it 1,000 times if I've seen it once. If I can get them to maintain the lordotic curve and keep that lower back arched with the rib cage up, maintain proper range of motion, make sure that it's a hip hinge and it's not spinal flexion simultaneously with hip flexion. You do a couple of those little tips that I threw in there for you, and more than likely that's going to take care of the issue. You have any questions about how you're training your clients right now? If you have any questions as to the programming that you're doing with them, you let us know. Go ahead and subscribe to our channel. And of course, you can hit the bell for notifications. Let us know how we can help you when it comes to actually training clients in the real world. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next week. Bye.